Greetings duelists and welcome to another video. I'm going to talk about a few cards that I have been taking into my side decks. I've been testing them out a lot, and like these are cards that are not really common to most duelists, but they are cards you should be able to consider when it comes to this format and probably the next one. So the first card I'm gonna talk about is Denko Seka. So why am I bringing up this card? Before we go on to it, we should read what it does. This monster came out in like 2014, 2015. I think it was around 2014, if I'm not mistaken. But basically, it's a thunder monster, and it reads that cannot be special summoned. While you control no set spell and traps, neither player can set spell or traps nor activate spell and traps that were already set. So, a little brief history. Back in the day, Denko Seka was pretty much used against heavy trap based strategies. In other formats, it really much shined against like a lot of anti-meta decks or a lot of decks that just were super optimal with them setting their cards. Um, as the game has progressed more and more, we've been getting more and more card interactions with flippable traps or with monsters being like their main forms of interruptions. So Denko Seka kind of felt like on the wayside and has not been seen a lot of play as of late. However, we're now slowly progressing into a format where setting cards are a little bit more important than before. So therefore, this card can be very utilized. The first matchup I want to talk about is Rescue Ace. If you guys already know, Rescue Ace have a win condition that involves the Rescue Ace Turbulence setting 4 spell and traps directly from the deck, meaning that there are 4 lines of interruption that you have to or interaction that you have to worry about besides just their monsters or their hand traps. That's where Denko Seka comes in. For all those spell and traps to be like flipped preemptively outside of like a few of the outside of the quick play spells, at least the trap cards, they require you to control a Rescue Ace monsters, and they all interact directly with monsters that your opponent has on the board. So as soon as you summon the Denko Seka, they cannot flip these cards. These cards are pretty much like contained, no pun intended. So they kind of have to find another way to deal with your strategy besides the cards they were already setting. So, like, if you have a deck that can apply pressure to your opponent and can deal with what your opponent has already on the board, besides, like, their 4 set cards, then Denko Seka is realistically a really good card for you. We're talking about like decks like Branded, for example, decks like Tearlament, and like other heavy combo decks that really don't rely on their normal summon. This is really good into all of those strategies. Another deck I kind of want to talk about is Unchained. So the reason I'm bringing up Unchained is because a lot of interaction Unchained does, it involves set cards. Whether it is setting cards to pop them or using Sarama's effect to set one of their traps. Like, if you time it correctly or you're playing a good strategy that can pair alongside this, Denko Seka can be really problematic for your opponent because it means they cannot use some of their cards. Another card I should mention is Chavara, the new Unchained monster. Like, as weird and as unironically as it sounds, like Denko Seka can just stop Unchained if they don't open the right monsters to extend in order to progress their turn. And that's going to be very important because I feel like Unchained is going to be a very popular deck very soon. So that's one way you can deal with them, and make it very, very awkward for them to just play the game. Um, Another deck I want to talk about is Labyrinth. So Labyrinth is a very tricky one because what happens with Labyrinth is half of their spell and traps are flippable cards. So there's not a huge amount of value that you get from Denko Seka if you draw it like going second. However, there are going to be instances where Labyrinth just has a lot of set cards and they're not going to flip them preemptively. They're just going to wait on you to interact with them in order to use those cards that are flipped. And that's where Denko Seka comes in. Denko Seka is really, really strong against that. Not many people are playing negation, summoning negation, like Solemns. So like just summoning Denko Seka just puts them in a very tight spot. If you have ways to deal with their monsters already on board, like their Lady Labyrinths, for example, then just Denko Seka could just win you the game outright. It has 1700 attack, which is really, really important because some people just end on Ariana, and Ariana has 1600 attack. So Denko Seka is really, really strong against that. Another important note is as long as Denko Seka is on board, your opponent cannot activate the furnitures, at least their hand effects, because the furnitures, their effects set monsters, and Denko Seka just stops that. Another matchup I want to talk about is the Chimera Fusion matchup. This deck is slowly gaining a lot of ground. This deck is getting more and more popular. And like just them having these cards set means that they can interact with you, and this card can only interact during the main phase. So if you summon the Koseka, that's you're halting one important interruption from them. And basically all you have to do is just deal with whatever they had on board. So yeah, that's very, very important to note. Sometimes they have the Super Poly set, and it's good to play around that as well. Trying to think what other matchups this could be like important against. Right now I pretty much brought up those. I guess the same thing that applies to the Chimera Fusion deck applies to Branded. Some interactions that Branded have involve like Branded in red, or Branded Banishment, and then Goseka just freezing all of those cards. It could be important. I don't want to talk about Dynamorphia too much because this deck is not really, really popular. However, I have been facing this deck a little bit unrated, surprisingly. So I kind of want to talk about the more rogue matchups because if you don't pay attention to rogue matchups, they will win the game on the spot. So like just letting you know that Denko Seka is another really good card against that deck because they don't flip their cards preemptively. They can only flip their frenzies during the main phase. So yeah, that's kind of it for that. So now the second card that I want to talk about is Epsilon. So Epsilon is a little different than Denko Seka. Basically, what the Epsilon does is it's basically Siphon Gear Gamma, but for trap cards. Whatever Denko Seka cannot clear, this thing can. And I think it's very important that we talk about both because as the game keeps progressing, we're going to be dealing with more and more trap cards, and just having like a wide scope of cards that can be covered with just 2 cards is really, really important because this game is ever evolving, and as we keep progressing in an open format, we're just going to progress against seeing more and more decks that just have to deal with like other cards. So Epsilon specifically deals with chainable traps, with that being like the welcome traps. Against Unchained is kind of important because sometimes they do preemptively flip their traps, like this one. Something important to note is it also helps you against like stuff like Eradicator and Dimensional Barrier, which is really really important because these two are staple cards in the Labyrinth deck, and like depending on what deck or strategy you're playing with, these cards can just outright win them the game. So Epsilon is really really important on that regard because it helps deal with those cards. Another matchup I kind of want to talk about is Purely. So when it comes to Purely, a lot of Pearly players are ending their board on an XYZ monster alongside the Purely Yip, and just stopping Purely Yip from resolving gives you a huge advantage. Like, it pretty much gives you an upper hand in the game. You're dealing with way less cards, and it makes it so whatever interactions they have against you are pretty much going to be like their hand traps, unless they have already another Purely boss monster on board. But for that to happen, they have to draw really really optimally. So this is something highly to consider when it comes to like using Epsilon. Like, it can cover the Purely matchup. So Anti-Spell Fragrance, that's another important card. It can also end the game if it's flipped. So just having another card against that is very important. Math Mech is not a popular deck, same as Dinomorphia. However, if they flip their cards, it pretty much is a pseudo win condition for them. So Epsilon just stopping those rogue decks from like doing their win condition just is really really strong. So another important note when it comes to Epsilon, this card is kind of future proof because in Age of Overlord we're getting the Arias, which is the Labyrinth Butler, and this card is really really strong. I think Labyrinth is going to be like one of the better decks of the format, depending on what happens on future ban list once Age of Overlord comes out, and this card is a really really strong catalyst for them. So like, just having a card that can deal with them, even whether you go first or second, is really really important, especially since this card is in the game. But yeah, I think I covered most of everything. I just wanted to talk about these two cards because when it comes to this game, player knowledge is super super important. The more cards you know about, the better prepared you are for them, or prepared using them as options whenever this comes to this format. I'm not saying that these two cards are going to be like staples in the next format. However, the way this format is shaping up and the way some decks are doing in the TCG as well as the OCG, these cards are kind of warranted to take into consideration because they are good against a plethora of strategies that are being seen play at the moment. I hope you found this informative. That's it from me. Keep practicing and keep dueling.